India is a Hindu country, and in the medieval era, foreigners and invaders came and destroyed Indian civilization, and we are in the process of reviving it, restoring India's past glory. That has been the main tradition.
So Babur, he comes to India with guns. By guns, I mean cannons, big ones, big artillery pieces. And then he also brings cards. In fact, he makes those cards while he's in Punjab. Aurangzeb was the bad Muslim who destroyed Hindus or any kind of composite culture that the Mughals had created, the Mughals before him had created. Whereas Akbar is this great guy who was really tolerant.
Secular.
Muslims and their kings actually tormented Hindus, and Hindus had to actually fight a war of liberation to get rid of them. So you see, it is easy and it is possible to alter memory or reshape memory of 1857 as it exists today in India. But it is not possible to erase the past or history.
Hello and welcome to The Federal. You're watching Off the Beaten Track, a program in which we take a deep dive on one subject. Now, India, as you all know, is a very old civilization, and at any point of time, we are marking or observing several anniversaries of different disparate things, at times even contradictory. Let me give you an example. We, for the past 1 year, have been marking the centenary year of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the ideological, bandwagon or ideological guide. Fountainhead is the right word, for the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the ruling party in India. Now, the entire politics of Hindutva, is premised on the fact that India is a Hindu country, and in the medieval era, foreigners and invaders came and destroyed Indian civilization, and we are in the process of reviving it, restoring India's past glory. That has been the main tradition through the centenary year also. Now, at the moment, at the same time, in a completely different contrast, we are also marking the 500th year anniversary of the advent of the Mughal dynasty in India. In April 1526, the First Battle of Panipat took place. Babur was victorious in that, and that started the Mughal dynasty, which continued really powerfully till the early 18th century, but thereafter lingered on till the middle of the 19th century. So we will be talking about the Mughal dynasty, its impact, what role did the Mughals play in shaping contemporary India. And to talk to me about the subject, I have with me Manimugdha Sharma, a very well-known author, writer, a radio TV jockey who's currently doing a PhD at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, who's been a journalist previously and has appeared on my shows several times. Mani, we are also going to be beginning this conversation with your book, the very important and a bestseller, Allahu Akbar, Understanding the Great Mughal in Today's India. So what I am going to be doing as I welcome you, that I'll ask you that we'll not only talk about Akbar, but understanding the Mughals in today's India. That is what we will try to do. And as I framed it, that there is a certain amount of contentious way of looking at the Mughals. Now, would you say, yes, sorry, you were saying something. I kind of...
No, I was just going to say hello to your
yes,
viewers,
please.
and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be on your show once again.
Thank you. Thank you. The Mughal era is not just a chapter in India's history textbooks. In various forms. At the moment, they are in the process of being rewritten. We do not know what character, what would be attributed to the Mughals once they are completely rewritten. But tell me something, that where do you fit the role, contribution and influence of the Mughal dynasty, of the Mughal period in contemporary India?
Well, you see, the Mughals are they have a phenomenal contribution to India's history, society, culture. They are massive on the cultural landscape, also on the physical landscape, because you can clearly see so many Mughal monuments in most cities of North and West India. So they are like physical markers and reminders of an era gone by. And the modern Indian state has actually utilized the Mughal state's contributions or the Mughal Empire's contributions in earning revenue. I mean, if we put it in simplest of terms, earning revenue through the monuments that the Mughals have left behind has filled our coffers and has also given reason to so many people, not just within India or modern South Asia, but even beyond, to come and visit us and see those landmarks. So they are there in your food, they are there in your attire, they are there in your literature, your language. So many languages that we speak have gone several centuries of development. And the Mughals are an important, they play a very important role. There are 300 years that they were there. Those 300 years were very formative in many of these languages, because the Mughal state actively contributed. They patronized uh, documents, translation of documents or books in different languages to Persian, and from Persian they go out uh, to Europe. There they get translated to English and French, and then eventually they come back when they are translated to other Indian languages. So this whole process would not have happened if we missed these 300 years in between. So, and I would think that any government that calls itself nationalist in the truest sense would have celebrated the Mughal Empire, because we make the fundamental mistake of comparing the Mughals to other Indian powers in various periods of time, their contemporaries as well as those that came before them. We make that mistake. But really, as a historian, I would say you should compare them to other empires of their time: the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Uzbeks, the French, the Spanish. All these existed during the same time. So we need to really look and compare the Mughal Empire with them. And if a nationalist government really was in place, they would be very proud of what the Mughals achieved, and they would celebrate their achievements as really Indian achievements. So that way, I would say they were a very Indian dynasty. They lived here, they died here. We see the most obvious signs of their presence. And they are also the most familiar to all of us.
Mhm.
I mean, you can ask anybody today to name the first 5 or 6 emperors or kings of that dynasty, talk about the Cholas or any other kingdom. And it is only the Mughals that people would know the most accurately. At least the first 6 Mughals, nobody would make a mistake. So that is not possible with any other dynasty in any other geography of India or any period
Right.
of India's history. So that way also they are very visible. You feel as if they are still alive because they are constant talking points. Their memory has survived. Memory, of course, gets erased, gets reshaped. All of that has happened with the Mughals as well. But the fact that we are still talking about them, we are still talking about 500 years of Babur's first coming and forming the first Sultanate, is an important reminder that they are still around us in so many ways.
Uh, well, they are constantly talked about, at times even disparagingly. We will talk about it. But we are talking about, say, the First Battle of Panipat, 1526, in the month of April. It is also said that the Mughals brought in a new military technology. India had not seen gunpowder, that a very small army of the Mughals could actually, you know, override over Ibrahim Lodi's much larger army. So, what kind of military changes, and even in terms of strategy, do we see that the Mughals contributed to India and it becoming quite accepted by the other empires which were also there in India around the same time?
Right. So, President Iqtidar Alam Khan wrote this very important book at the early part of the previous decade. And he, in fact, when this new century dawned in, at that time, he had written a book. And in that, he had shown that the Mughals were not really the first. there were other empires and dynasties who had been using gunpowder firearms and
Okay.
for a very long period of time. What Babur's contribution was unique was in the sense that he brought in field artillery, and field artillery deployment was seen for the first time in a big way at the Battle of Panipat, the First Battle of Panipat on the 21st of April, 1526. And along with that, he also had matchlock men, and he learned this from the Ottomans. Now, Babur uses the term Rum Dasturi for his formation, and that itself implies that he learned it from the Ottomans. Rum being for the Ottoman Empire, because they were again descendants of the Roman Empire after having defeated Byzantine and the Eastern Roman Empire.
Okay.
They became Kaisar-e Rum. The Ottoman Sultan was called Kaisar-e Rum, Mehmed II, for instance. So you had the Rum or the Romans that way. So Rum Dasturi is a term that Babur uses, and he marries that with a very Central Asian tactic of the Tulaghma. So you see a coming together of two different traditions, one from Central Asia, one which was taking shape in parts of Europe, because the Ottomans were also present in Europe as well as in Asia. So a marriage of two different traditions. And what he brings to India actually foxes his enemies. So the first time the Ibrahim...
What is the strategy in terms of, for a layman to understand?
Right.
What are these two things which he fused?
So Babur, he comes to India with guns. By guns, I mean cannons, big ones, big artillery pieces. And then he also brings carts. In fact, he makes those carts while he is in Punjab. These are, so there's the tactic called the wagon laga. So this is how the Hungarians used to fight. The Hussites used to fight. The Ottomans were fighting against them, and they saw that they were using this tactic. The Ottomans adopted them. Babur saw the Ottomans, or whatever they achieved at Chaldoran in 1514 while fighting the Safavids, and he introduces that, he adopts that technology and starts using it. Now, what happens here is you have carts tied together with chains, and then you have artillery pieces set in between them. And as I said, chains. So these chains are lowered when you're fighting. But if there's a cavalry charge, the chains, these are big chains, which are then raised, and no cavalry can really cross. So your guns are not captured, right? And then you have infantry.
They're in front of the guns.
Yes. So you have your infantrymen behind those carts. The artillerymen are firing, and the infantry are just waiting behind. Should somebody try to cross, then the infantry can take care of that. And the Tulkhama tactic is a entirely South Asian tactic where the Mongols were using them, the Turks were using them. What you do is you really have the flanks go out. These are horsemen, light horsemen, archers, mounted archers, most of them. They would start shooting arrows on both sides of the enemy, on the flanks of the enemy. They would hit, they would come back. They would hit, they would come back. And what would happen as a result of this is that the enemy gets hemmed in by both sides. And you have a concentrated mass in the middle of the enemy formation. So your left and right have all collapsed. It's one huge center now. And that's when the time the heavy cavalry is unleashed, and the heavy cavalry just goes in and cuts down to a man. So that's how the Tulkhama tactic was used. Babur was a victim of that tactic in Central Asia. He loses out against Shaybani Khan and his Uzbeks because they used to look
comes and use what was used against him.
Exactly.
So he learns from his defeats.
Absolutely. And he uses it against Ibrahim Lodi and also against the Rajputs at Khanwa. The very next year, in 1527, the bigger battle of Khanwa happens. And Babur uses it effectively against the huge Rajput coalition. So first Battle of Panipat, the Battle of Khanwa, nobody really has any answer to Babur's tactics because it's a compact band of brothers that has survived very harsh conditions. They have been fighting for years together, and now they're in the plains of Hindustan. And the way Mughals used to march, it's like in the end, and eventually that became the Mughal way of fighting. These would be entire cities on the march. Okay, so they would not go like all the baggage goes behind, and then you have the army which is like fighting ahead. So it's like the entire city which is moving, right, with them. So you have their bazaars and all of that. That would become a traditional Mughal style of fighting eventually. Now, so this was something which no Indian power could match at that time. But we see that within the next 10 years, The following 10
Hmm.
years, the Mughals lose that advantage
Because the
because
others learn.
and that tells you that there were guns, there was a know-how to use guns. It's just that the Mughals showed them the way to do it, and other
Okay.
Indian powers were very quick to adapt, and they did, and then they started resisting the Mughals. You had Sher Shah defeat Humayun at Kannauj.
Right.
You had many other Indian. Bahadur Shah was again fighting against the Mughals, who didn't quite succeed, but he was able to show the Mughals that they could be resisted. And you also have to remember that the Portuguese were pretty much a power at this point, and the Portuguese were also using guns. Most of them
Okay.
were naval guns, but they were still using it.
But they were
Before
in
Babur,
very restricted territories, right? The Portuguese?
they were mostly on the coastal areas, but whenever
Yes.
they were fighting with cannons. And I'll give you one example here: the Battle of Cochin that happens in 1506. This is long before Babur had come, long before Chaldoran. And the
Mhm.
Portuguese defeat the Zamorin of Calicut by using guns. And we know from the sources that the Zamorin of Calicut also had cannons, which he had acquired from the Venetians, because the Venetians were also traders. They were also bringing in weapons from Europe. So clearly, the know-how was there. It is just
Yes.
that with field artillery, the way the Mughals deploy them, Babur was able to surprise his enemy, in this case, Ibrahim Lodi and the Sultan of Delhi.
Right.
And he was able to create an empire, which he loses, by the way. I mean, his
Yes.
descendant loses, his
Yes.
son Humayun. But then they are able to get it back. And that, I think, is a phenomenal story, because in some ways, I would say that the first and the second battles of Panipat have some common themes, because both Babur and Akbar were fighting for survival during this point. They did not have big armies, and they fought a bigger adversary, at least in terms of numbers, and they were able to succeed and eventually save their empire. In fact, in Akbar's case, he managed to create an even bigger empire than
Yes.
Babur had possibly imagined he could build in his own lifetime. So this was new that the Mughals introduced, but we often forget that it was their mounted archers, the light cavalry, that really was a trump card that Babur had and other Indian powers did not, except maybe Alauddin Khilji several centuries earlier, because he was
Yes,
fighting.
but that was
Yeah,
previous, earlier.
yeah.
Now let's move on to another subject. In today's India, we quite often talk about our composite or syncretic culture.
Mhm.
Now, to my understanding, it straight away goes back to the Mughal period. That's the time when culture was an Indo-Persian cultural fusion. The structure of cultural synthesis is something that happened during, or rather, very consciously pushed by the Mughals. Will you tell me something about it as to how does this idea of two different civilizations, two different cultures, the Mughals worked for the not really merger, but some kind of a synthesis of the two.
Hmm. Now, we have to understand that the Mughals don't arrive in a vacuum. The
Right.
sultanates that were there even before the Mughals came did have some sort of a common culture by that time. The Mughals are new entrants into this whole composite mix.
Hmm.
And the way they were able to make compromises, have alliances with different dynasties and rulers, and have these very strong cultural exchanges. Now, Persian, when the Mughals come, was already the lingua franca of the empire, of the previous empire, because they have been using this language since the 13th, the 14th centuries. So already there was a 200-year, 300-year history of Persian being a language of courtly culture, language of aspiration in
Okay.
India or in the subcontinent at that time. So the Mughals come into this mix and they quickly adapt to Indian mannerisms. And we see this in the way their clothes are designed, and we have paintings to that effect. And
Right.
we see that they also they pick up Indian foods, Indian ways of cooking, but they also introduce their own Central Asian ways. So it is a fusion, it's a mix. And so when Humayun goes, for instance, to the court of the Safavid Shah, Shah Tahmasp, the Shah actually makes a request that Humayun should throw a feast for him and
Hmm.
only cook the best food from Hindustan.
Okay.
And Humayun cooks khichdi, dal khushke. It's
Mhm.
a form of khichdi, I think. The food historians can tell you better. But dal kushka is what Humayun's chefs prepare, and this is something that they picked up from India. And so already by the time Humayun became a refugee, they had picked up these Indian foods and Indian ways of cooking. Mughals add to that, they add their own mix. They bring all these artisans from other parts of Eurasia. You have cooks, Khansamas, all these people who are coming from Iran, from Turan, which is modern day Central Asia. You had painters and artists who are coming. You have masons who are coming from different parts of Eurasia, and they are settling down in the empire. So naturally, there would be a flourishing of a unique composite culture, which is Hindustani and which is also Central Asian, which is a unique culture which we today call Hindustani Tehzeeb. I think that is clearly a result of this 300 years, of these 300 years of the Mughals in India. So that way, you see the cultural landscape change pretty much during the time of the Mughals. You see a flowering of a new composite culture which comes. It is actually building on the previous experiments that others had done, but the Mughals do it in a whole new way because they are also able to capture a bigger part of the subcontinent. Other sultanates were not very successful that way because Alauddin Khilji, for instance, was the first sultan who actually goes to the Deccan and wins. But the later sultans are not able to hold on to the southern part of India. The Mughals try to do it. Akbar is successful to some extent that he goes to the gates of the Deccan. It's really his son and grandson and great-grandson, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, who actually expand the empire to its greatest height. So because they have expanded, now their system of governance, their mannerisms are now picked up by other local elites. And the local elites also have this relationship with the Mughals that, okay, well, not every area could be controlled directly by the empire. So you have these alliances, small allies, who are feudatories of the Mughals, who are sending them contribution, revenue, all of that. And they're also trying to maintain their own distinct, smaller identities. But they're also adapting, they're also taking to the Mughals in their manner. So you have these smaller courts which are identical to the royal court at Delhi, which shape up in Bengal, in Bihar, and everywhere else of the empire, on the fringes of the empire. And in fact, those who resist the Mughals, they also adapt their manners.
Same manners and same traditions.
Exactly. So all of that. So the term Badshah, Padishah, for instance, has such strong appeal that even Chhatrapati Shivaji is using that for himself.
That term for himself.
Right?
That's right.
So and you see that the term, for instance, the King of Delhi, and Delhi being this like central capital of the country in so many ways. Yes, the modern nation state of India made New Delhi the capital. Yes, the British moved their capital from Calcutta to Delhi in 1911. That was a reason why this happened. But even before there was a united India, you had Delhi being like the center of importance.
Political
and
power.
The King of Delhi being referred to as Dillishwar by Sanskrit writers in other courts that were outside the control of the Mughals. It just gives you the indication that Delhi had so much appeal. Babur himself, when he conquers Delhi, he says, this is the capital of Hindustan, is the heart of Hindustan. He says that. So this whole thing that the Mughals create, a lot of it they did not do actively. It became a result of their being in India for such a long time and for being so successful for a very long time. I think it's also important thing to remember that they were successful for a very long time, and they created this whole appeal of South Asia or India outside. That's why all these trading companies were coming to India at the same time when the Mughals were there and they were at the peak of their power.
Yes, in fact, it's very important to understand also as to how the Mughals negotiated with the British who were coming in.
Yes.
How did that happen? Could you tell us something about it? What was their tactics and their gains, their losses?
Yeah, of course. So like any other trading power, the English also arrive. And for a long time, they're trying to...
They come into the Mughal Empire sometime around the 18th century, right?
No,
or
they
even
come during
before?
the time of Jahangir. When Jahangir is
Okay.
the emperor, that's when Sir Thomas Roe comes in 1615, and he is able to get a privilege from the Mughal emperor because
Okay.
they wanted to set up a factory in Gujarat, and Gujarat was the fiefdom of Khurram, the future Shah Jahan. Khurram was already smitten by the Portuguese. He thought the Portuguese were very powerful and they controlled the high seas. Many of these Mughal trading ships going to the rest of West
The
Asia
world. Yeah.
were actually escorted by the Portuguese men of war or Portuguese
Okay.
gunships. And the Mughals actually had to pay a dastak, which was a
Suspect is a kind of a
kind of a
tax.
tax to the
Toll.
Portuguese, yeah, to carry out
How
their
interesting.
yeah. So and so therefore they were the sole power, European power, and they had been there for a long time. You have to remember that by 1510, Goa was captured by the Portuguese. That place was taken away from the Adil Shahis of Bijapur.
Yes.
So the Mughals, when they come in, Babur arrives after that, 16 years after the Portuguese had conquered Goa. And Babur, by that time, knew that they were. He must have known. He doesn't indicate that he really knew the Portuguese, but he must have known. It's impossible not to know what the
Yes.
Portuguese were doing at that time. And by the time Akbar comes, we see that there is this direct competition happening with the Portuguese. When Akbar attacks Goa and takes over the Sultanate over there, the Portuguese actually send a fleet to relieve the garrison. In fact, he is fighting the Mirzas at that time, like other Timurid princes who were holding power in Gujarat
Okay.
after destroying the Gujarat Sultanate. So he is fighting against these Mirzas, and the Mirzas, they managed to get a fleet from the Portuguese. But the Portuguese fleet does not open fire because he sees the Mughal military with their heavy guns, and then they think that it's better to have an alliance with them than to wage war
Then,
against them.
and how does Jahangir, negotiate with the British and the emerging East India
Yeah,
Company? Of course, it would
right.
have been at that point. It's
Nobody took
after
them seriously at that time. They did not think that the Portuguese,
the
my
British.
bad, the British could actually do proper trade. And therefore, eventually, when he's able to get some kind of a treaty, not exactly a treaty, it's a farman in favor of the East India Company. And that's why you had the first victory come up at Surat, right? Because Gujarat was a very rich province. And as I said, the fiefdom of Khurram.
Yeah.
And so Khurram eventually he relents because, and it's another great story how hard Thomas Roe tries to get concessions, and he in fact writes to the directors of the company that they are totally beholden to the Portuguese. They think we are no match for the Portuguese. We need to show them something. And the British actually managed to defeat a Portuguese fleet, the Royal Navy. That's also the beginning of the Indian Navy of today, because East India Company's marine defeats a Portuguese fleet. And because of that, they get privileges of establishing a factory in Surat, because the Mughal Empire now realizes, well, if the Portuguese have been defeated,
Then the
they
British
they
are the
have,
ones to be quoted.
yeah, they have uh, something about them. So the Portuguese come, the British come, they establish their factory, then they'll start expanding as well. And we see that you have these power centers in Madras, in Calcutta. Calcutta happens also towards the end of Aurangzeb's
Of
reign.
the
Like in 1690s, that's when three villages are given out to the company, and then the city of Calcutta is founded. And that is largely the story because Madras presidency also comes under a Mughal Suba. And eventually the Suba of Arcot, which is again towards the end of the Mughal Empire. But they were still having these Subas coming up. The term Suba itself is now used in so many Indian languages to refer to Indian states, but this is essentially a construct from the Mughal period.
from the Mughal period.
Right.
You know
And
that
yeah.
when you say that it's a construct from the Mughal period, that also brings to my mind the administration. We talk about the administrative setup of India at the moment. States and provinces, Indian administrative service, fairly. A lot of it has actually emerged from the colonial
Mhm.
systems. But within the colonial systems, how much of the Mughal influence do you actually find in terms of governance, creating structures of governance?
There were influences, of course. The Mughal legal system also played a
And
big
the
role.
taxation system. That's
Taxation
most
system
important.
also, yeah. So all of that did play a very important role in the formation of the colonial state. Now we have to understand that the British consciously presented themselves as the legitimate successors of the Mughals. You have a poem by Tennyson, Lord Tennyson, for instance, where the Mughal glory is being talked about. You have other English people who are also writing about it. But at the same time, they're also showing that, look, we have ended this barbaric system that the East was continuing with. So now you have a different set of rulers who are giving you better governance. And to Hindus specifically, this was communicated that we have liberated you from the tyranny of the Mughals, of the Muslims, right? But at the same time, they were also using the Mughal name for legitimacy. We have to understand that for the longest period, until 1857, the East India Company was ruling in the name of the Mughal emperor. So
Yes.
obviously, they were taking some of the administrative frameworks that the Mughals had.
Of the Mughals.
Yes, they did take it. They improved upon it. They introduced their own systems. But the whole taxation system for a long time was continued on the pattern of the Mughals. The land revenue systems, for instance, in parts of Bengal and Assam, you would still find the use of administrative terms of Mughal coinage. Land
Really?
revenue administration, for instance, the property taxes, the land taxes that people pay, the land, the way it is assessed in Bengal and in Assam, they still use those Mughal terms, la khairaj, khairaj, and nisf khairaj, which is la khairaj means no tax. It's a free land.
Okay.
Nisf khairaj means you have half 50% tax. So these terms that the British East India Company used and later on the colonial state used, they continued with from the time of the Mughals. They did not really upset that structure. They used many of the names that we still use today that the Mughals had used. But of course, they also wanted to show that their system is better, and the court system that they established was actually a direct statement that they put out that our system is better than what was existing in India. Now, they studied Indian legal systems. They thought that Hindus should have a different law, Mohammedans should have a different
Should
law.
have differently.
Yeah, so they did all of that. And mind you, when after winning Bengal, the initial administration that they set up during Lord Robert Clive's time and even after that, they relied on the Mughal officials to do that for them. Muhammad Reza Khan and Shitab Rai, these were the people who were actually the keys to the English administration in Bengal in the aftermath of the Battle of Plassey. And they continued. They continued to use Persian as the state language until the 1830s. That's when they used Urdu, and that led
Well, I
to
remember, Raja Ram Mohan Roy bringing out a first newspaper in
yes,
Persian. That is
yes,
what very
absolutely.
remarkable thing which we need to recall and talk about it as to how it was all interwoven at that time.
Absolutely, because Persian was the language of culture. It was also the language of aspiration. And this happened largely during the Mughal period. You had all these Brahmins and Kayasthas who were very quick to learn this language, and they also eventually produced some of the fascinating histories of the period.
Yes.
Chandravan Brahman's work, account of the empire and the Aurangzeb, for instance, is remarkable. You have other people who were Brahmins and Kayasthas who mastered this language. Raja Ram Mohan Roy's family was also a beneficiary of that arrangement. They're very rich people and then
True.
very proficient in Persian. So the East India Company continues with Persian because they were not really trying to dismantle the Mughal system. But afterwards, we see that they started replacing it with their own construct. And Urdu is a language which is introduced for in the 1834 is I think when
After 1857, also several changes.
absolutely, because
Yeah.
it had to be broken,
Yes.
and the Indians had to be told, and this language that they were liberating Hindus from the clutches of the barbaric Muslims is essentially a post
That becomes
1857
part of
language.
the history of India that they are writing, and that in fact created a lot of problems in
Right.
having an understanding of a composite India at the time of independence and even during the national movement. There is one more issue. Whenever we talk about the Mughals, there is always this comparison between Akbar the Great and Aurangzeb the Destroyer.
Mhm.
Tell us something about it.
Yeah, this is essentially a colonial framing, and nationalist historians also continued with it. But I think as early as the 1960s, we see a diversion from there. People decided to break with that. For
But it is
instance,
still that's the way perceived within people at large.
it is, of course, and this is really a contribution of the British and not the Mughals. That you have this binary that Aurangzeb was the bad Muslim who destroyed Hindus or any kind of composite culture that the Mughals had created, the Mughals before him had created. Whereas Akbar is this great guy who was really tolerant,
Secular,
yes,
secular,
secular,
which
liberal,
he
and all
was,
of
in a way that he was definitely, Sulaykul. I'd like to hear about that also very
that.
briefly.
Right. Right, but then so this doesn't help at all, and we should not be having these kind of colonial frames to understand history in today's India, because the discipline of history has developed, has progressed so much. We have moved away from all of that. It's no longer person centric. History is no longer individual centric or great people centric. It's more about structures, systems, and processes that really shaped that empire and the life of the subjects. What kind of taxation was there? How were people's lives impacted by all that? So this colonial framing doesn't really help. And I hear, unfortunately, people on TV as well as the new right-wing historians who claim that they are trying to decolonize Indian history by using the same colonial frame, the same Hindu and Muslim period, which is a discarded thing in academia. Nobody talks about it. And this whole positivist history, which again is a discarded. I mean, it's useful to study it. This whole positivist way of writing history, of which Sir Jadunath Sarkar was a very famous
Right.
example. But nobody does history like that anymore. We should not look at individuals or compare individuals, because Aurangzeb's circumstances and his context was different from Akbar. It's not like
Right.
the father would have the same situation as the son, or
It's
his.
just like that in contemporary India, the context of the present
Yes,
government is completely different from the context of the previous government ruled by the BJP. Mr. Vajpayee as prime
absolutely.
minister. It's completely different from Mr. Narendra Modi as prime minister.
Absolutely. And as the Mughal Empire expanded, it came into conflict with other contending parties, because we have to understand that at every age, people have been aspirational. They all wanted to be a part of this empire and have benefits. Now, wherever the Mughal system failed to take into account all these local aspirations, they came into conflict. We see this acutely during the time of Aurangzeb, because Aurangzeb did not have that in him that Akbar had. That he was not a very good negotiator. He was not somebody who could really take everyone together with him, because by now the imperial identity was consolidated, it was cast in stone, and the emperor was like at the head of this empire, and nobody could really challenge him. Akbar was still at the formative stage, where so he had to strike compromises with people, with other ruling elites. So he was able to do it, and he was also individually, as an individual, who was very different. And you don't see another Akbar in India's history. I mean, he was a completely different sort of a man. And Aurangzeb is a very different person at
Kind
the.
of a person.
Yes. So, I mean, how can you really equate the two? How can you really compare the two? It's different personalities and different periods of time. Aurangzeb had his own challenges. Whether or not he succeeded or failed in them is a debate worth having.
But what about this, accusation that they destroyed Hindu places of worship, which has actually been pivotal to rejuggling or rejigging entire Indian politics and the political discourse of the country in the last 4 decades?
Yes. And temple destruction or desecration is, and other historians have demonstrated this. Richard Eaton has written Rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier, in which he has tackled this question. And there are other historians, Audrey Trushky has talked about it in her book. Of course, Audrey Trushky is not liked by Hindu
Yes,
nationalists.
by the Hindu nationalists, but yes, we have to
Yes,
take note of her work.
absolutely. And she, in fact, uses or cites Richard Eaton's work. And there are others also. Now, we have to understand that empire making is a gut wrenching process. And if
Yes,
one empire is forming, it is obviously going to crush others in the way. The
that's right.
Mughal Empire never needed an excuse to wage war. This is what Pratyay Nath has shown in his book.
Mhm.
They really needed no excuse. They could go to war at any time against
Anytime,
anyone
anytime.
without any kind of pretense. That's how the Mughal state was. That's how it expanded. So
I think that
obviously,
is the way any political dispensation does, you know. India's present political dispensation, I
yeah,
find, you know, they have picked this up from the Mughal strategy.
yeah,
That never
absolutely.
stopped, you know. There's always a continuity of what we are doing.
I remember Professor Harbans Mukhia had, I think, in 2014, done an article in which Narendra Modi's image was used with a Mughal turban on his head, and that actually riled so many of his supporters. But anyway, so the Mughal state, as I said, they needed no excuse for war, and in the process, they did destroy temples or places of worship. We see this in
Right. But
Aurangzeb.
did they do it to expand their political footprint, or did they do it because of their religious pursuit?
I mean, religion was always used. It would be wrong to assume that religion did not play a role. And obviously, we know this from the accounts that were written of that time. The Mughal historians and any historian of a Muslim emperor, and we know this because Blaine Orr writes about it, they would try to legitimize the actions of their king by invoking religion. That this was a jihad, this was a holy war. Lashkar-e-Islam, we see this in Mughal accounts. Lashkar-e-Islam defeated this, defeated that. All
Okay.
infidels were destroyed, and all of that. So this religious framing is essentially the work of these people, the chroniclers. They wanted to legitimize whatever the kings had done. Now, the motivations of power have always been the same. Of course, its manifestations are a little different. Now, during Akbar's period or Aurangzeb's period, we see that they were fighting wars with these empires, and temples or other institutions of other kings were really places through which the kings drew their legitimacy. A temple, and we see this even later. For instance, Tipu Sultan, he spares the Ranganatha
Yes.
Swami temple, but he destroys a temple in Srirangapatnam, which was patronized by the Wadiyar dynasty, whom he had replaced.
Hmm.
So he lets one temple stand, and this is a more
So it is
prominent.
also linked to the political strategy. That is what we
Absolutely.
can say.
So these temples, and we have to understand that temples of today are not what temples of yore were like. Temples were
Right.
institutions, and sometimes they would also have their own military, they would have their bazaars and all of that. It was happening at that time. And that's why the kings were going after those temples if they thought that this was a source of legitimacy for the king. And you see Hindu kings do the same
Right.
thing to other Hindu kings. The Muslims were, of course, they were, because it was, once they did something, they destroyed a temple, it was
Hmm.
a glory for the faith. So they would do it.
Yes.
And I don't think that needs to be like qualified in any way. They did it. The Mughals
Yes.
did. The people before them did.
And there is no need for anybody to be apologetic about it.
Absolutely no. Yeah,
There
yeah.
is no need to put the blame on contemporary Muslims for what happened in history. Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then they all did this. And so we have to accept them as they were. And it's not that any of these kings were like great heroes who were trying to do everything for the people. They were all rulers, and every ruler has their own motivation.
And that is the way we have to look at every ruler, even before the medieval era. Right.
Absolutely. So the Mughals are an early modern dynasty. They come into existence in India, but they have a longer presence in Central Asia. I mean, Babur's
Right.
descendants essentially started an empire, but Babur himself was a product of the Timurid clan, and his great
Exactly.
ancestor was Amir Temur, and on his mother's side was Chinggis Khan. So he had a
Yes.
different standard to emulate. Akbar had a different standard to emulate. Aurangzeb had a different standard to
Yes.
emulate. So
That's right.
their all icons were very different, and their reference points were also very different. So we have to understand that when we need to respect that. And at the end, we need to look at this empire as a whole, not as one individual king going after Hindus or attacking other
Right.
Muslims. That's not the way history is looked at. We have to look at systems of governance. We have to look at land revenue reforms.
Yes.
Were the Mughals able to improve the lot of the people, of the peasants, or people in their empire? They were, yes, largely. Were the Mughals able to have a name for themselves internationally? Yes, absolutely. And
Yes.
you have the term Great Mughal, for instance, which was coined outside India by these different empires in Europe. You see the Great Mughal in English. In Italian, they say Great Mogor, Mogor. In German, they say Groot Mughal.
Hmm.
So in all these European languages, you have the term Great Mughal in different forms. You see, Aurangzeb, of course, is the bad guy in history for many Hindu nationalists, but it is actually Aurangzeb's empire which was at the pinnacle of power and
That's right.
strength.
That was.
And Aurangzeb, so there's a replica of his court created by a European king, which is still on display today. And he, in fact, spent more money on creating this than on creating his own palace. So you see the appeal of the Mughal brand. You see Rembrandt, who never stepped out of his country, who never really visited India. He was still getting these copies of Mughal portraits that people were getting, these
Yes.
trading companies were getting from India. He was drawing sketches of various Mughal elites and selling them, and many of them are unfinished, but he was still doing it. Why was he doing it? Why was John Dryden writing a play on Aurangzeb? And this was a great flourishing of English culture at that time. Why was he writing about the Mughals? So you have to
So
ask these questions. They were being written about because they were influential, they were an important power. Why were the Ottomans trying to have an alliance with the Mughals after their defeat in Vienna in 1693? That's an important question to ask, because even the Ottoman Sultan, who's again vying for legitimacy with the Mughals, because the Mughals are not recognizing the Ottomans. Ottomans claim the title of the Caliph or the Khalifa. The Mughals never really acknowledged them as Khalifa, because it's instructive to read the letter that Humayun writes and Akbar sends to the Ottoman Sultan, where he says that it's great that you have established your caliphate, but we are the caliphs of our land. Why do you think Akbar called himself Imam Adil? Because here he was trying to compete with
what
the
does that mean?
Shia Shah. It means he's a Imam Adil, means a leader of the faith. And because the Safavid Shah had that title, why did he call himself Amirul Mominin? Because that's what the Ottoman Sultan was calling himself, being the Khalifa of Islam. So these titles were used as counters to other empires.
And they definitely are part of the Indian civilization. And you wouldn't advocate that when we look at Indian history, as is being demanded now, that we erase or overlook the entire medieval period, and most importantly the Mughals, because they are seen to be as representative of all the Mughal Muslim emperors who have ruled India from the 10th or the 11th century onwards. So this erasure, you think that it is not a thing to work out, but instead of that, we must look at it as a composite history of India, right?
Absolutely. And Mughals were Indian. They were an Indian dynasty. They lived and died on this soil. They're buried on this soil. Their monuments, their way of life continues to fascinate us. We still have movies being made on the Mughals. Even if you
That's right.
criticize them, even if you disparage them, you do it because there is tremendous appeal for brand Mughal. That's why you do it. Every other adversary that the Mughals had, whether it is Rana Pratap Singh of Mewar, whether it is Chhatrapati Shivaji, everyone, their importance would fade away if you take away the Mughals, because they became important because they were fighting the Mughals.
Because they stood up against the to the Mughals.
Exactly.
That's very well put. And Manimugdha Sharma, at this point, I will say that it's been an extremely interesting and very insightful, walk through the importance and the relevance of the Mughal dynasty 500 years after they first stepped their foot on the land. It's really been wonderful to talk to you about something which needs to be spoken, because Indians cannot draw their heritage just from one religion, but we are actually a composite group of people, and we need to constantly keep on talking about our mixed heritage to be able to retain the kind of character that we were when India became independent. Thank you so much once again, Manimugdha Sharma.
Thank you very much, Nilanja. But can I just say one final thing before we
Yes,
end this? I
yes,
just wanted to
please.
give you an example of how history and memory are different. Memory is also a tool of history, but memory by itself is not history. History is a process of
That's right.
reconstructing the past as much as possible. We can never really fully reconstruct the past, as the positivist scholar or the Rankian scholars used to think. No modern scholar really thinks that way. But uh, if you see that before 2014, 1857, we in fact had the 150th anniversary of 1857 in
That's right.
2007. I was a journalist at that time. I had covered that rally from Meerut to Delhi.
Exactly.
And so the memory of 1857 until 2014 was actively promoted as something where Hindus and Muslims fought together, and that's why we are Indians. We are one
And
people.
something that was even written about in an entire book by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar.
Absolutely. So, but in the last 12, 13 years, have you heard any kind of celebration or any kind of glorification of the Hindu Muslim element of 1857? You don't.
No.
Here, the greatest story now is that, well, Muslims and their kings actually tormented Hindus, and Hindus had to actually fight a war of liberation to get rid of them. So you see, it is easy and it is possible to alter memory or reshape memory of 1857 as it exists today in
Hmm.
India. But it is not possible to erase the past or history, which really is the defining line or the dividing line between
Well,
history.
well said. And this conversation with you will go a long way in ensuring that history doesn't really get erased. Thank you so much, Manimukh, once again.
Thank you very much, Nilanjanda.
It's
Always a
really been
pleasure to
wonderful
speak
to
with you.
speak to you.